The Bible's first lie, the four anonymous authors who secretly wrote the Torah. For over 2,000 years, billions of people have believed that Moses climbed Mount Sinai, received divine revelation, and personally wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. It's a foundational belief that shaped Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But what if I told you that modern scholarship has uncovered something that challenges this ancient tradition so fundamentally that it threatens the very foundation of how we understand biblical authorship? What if the Torah wasn't written by Moses at all, but by 4 completely different people, living in different centuries, with different agendas and different theological perspectives? What if these anonymous authors left behind fingerprints so distinct that scholars can now separate their individual contributions like forensic investigators at a crime scene? This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. This is mainstream biblical scholarship, accepted by virtually every major university and seminary in the world. And yet, most people have never heard of it. Why? Because the implications are staggering. Today, we're going to uncover what scholars call the documentary hypothesis, a theory so compelling that it has revolutionized our understanding of the Bible's origins. We're going to examine the evidence that led researchers to conclude that the Torah is actually a masterful compilation of 4 separate documents written by 4 anonymous authors who never intended their works to be combined. And we're going to explore why this discovery matters far beyond academic circles. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how modern scholars can read the same biblical passages you've known your entire life and see not one voice, but 4 distinct authors speaking across centuries. You'll learn to recognize the literary fingerprints each writer left behind. And you'll discover why this revelation has been called both the most important breakthrough in biblical studies and the most dangerous challenge to traditional faith. But first, let me show you just how convincing this evidence really is. Imagine you're reading a story about a flood that destroys the world. The author tells you it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Then, just a few verses later, the same author tells you the flood lasted 150 days. The story says Noah brought 2 of every animal onto the ark, but then it also says he brought 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. You might think you're reading a story with some inconsistencies, maybe some copyist errors over the centuries. But what if I told you these weren't errors at all? What if these contradictions were actually evidence that you were reading 2 completely different flood stories that had been carefully woven together by an ancient editor? Welcome to the world of biblical source criticism, where scholars have spent over 2 centuries unraveling one of history's most sophisticated literary puzzles. The story begins in 18th century France with a court physician named Jean Astruc. In 1753, Astruc was studying the book of Genesis when he noticed something peculiar. In some passages, God was called by the name Yahweh, often rendered as Jehovah in English. In other passages, God was referred to simply as Elohim, the Hebrew word for God. This wasn't random. The different names appeared in distinct clusters, and each cluster seemed to have its own style, vocabulary, and theological perspective. Astruc proposed something revolutionary for his time. Maybe Moses hadn't composed Genesis from scratch. Maybe he had compiled it from older documents, some of which used one name for God and others which used a different name. It was a reasonable explanation, and it still preserved Moses as the final author. But Astruc had no idea that his modest proposal would eventually lead to the complete dismantling of Mosaic authorship. Over the next century, scholars began to notice far more than just different names for God. They discovered that the Bible contained what they called doublets, parallel accounts of the same events that contradicted each other in significant ways. There were 2 creation stories in Genesis with completely different sequences of events. There were 2 versions of the 10 Commandments with different wording. There were multiple versions of the same genealogies with different numbers and names. But here's what made these discoveries so compelling. When scholars separated these doublets based on their vocabulary, style, and theological concerns, they found that each version was internally consistent. It was as if someone had taken two different newspapers reporting on the same events, cut them up, and then carefully interwoven the pieces to create a single narrative that preserved both accounts. The breakthrough came in the late 19th century when German scholar Julius Wellhausen synthesized decades of research into what became known as the documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen argued that the Torah wasn't the work of Moses at all, but rather the product of four distinct sources that had been compiled centuries after Moses' supposed lifetime. These four sources, known by the letters J, E, D, and P, each had their own historical context, their own theological agenda, and their own literary style. And when you learned to recognize their individual characteristics, the Bible transformed from a single, unified text into a complex archaeological site where you could literally excavate the layers of tradition that had accumulated over centuries. Let me show you how this works in practice by examining the flood narrative, one of the clearest examples of source separation in the entire Bible. When you read the flood story in Genesis as it appears in your Bible, you're actually reading two completely different accounts that have been skillfully woven together. One account, which scholars attribute to the priestly source or P, describes a cosmic catastrophe where the very foundations of creation are undone. In this version, the flood lasts exactly 1 year. Noah brings 2 of every animal species, and the story is told with the precise ritualistic language typical of priestly writers. The other account, attributed to the Jahwist or J source, tells a more intimate story, where God literally smells the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice and promises never again to destroy the earth. In this version, the flood lasts 40 days. Noah brings 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, and the language is anthropomorphic, describing God in very human terms. Here's where it gets fascinating. When you separate these two accounts and read them independently, each one tells a complete, coherent story with no contradictions. But when the ancient editor combined them, he preserved both traditions even though they disagreed on fundamental details. Why would an editor do this? Because both stories were considered sacred. Both had been passed down through generations of believers. Both carried theological truths that the editor wanted to preserve. So rather than choosing one version over the other, he found a way to honor both traditions by weaving them together into a single narrative. This editorial technique appears throughout the Torah. The 2 creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 represent different sources with different theological perspectives on humanity's relationship to God. The multiple covenant stories with Abraham reflect different traditions about when and how God established his relationship with the patriarch. Even the giving of the law at Mount Sinai shows evidence of multiple sources being combined. But the sources weren't just different versions of the same stories. Each source represented a distinct period in Israel's history and reflected the concerns of its particular time and place. The J source, or Jahwist, appears to have been written in the southern kingdom of Judah during the reign of King Solomon in the 10th century BCE. This source is characterized by its use of the divine name Yahweh, its anthropomorphic descriptions of God, and its focus on the promises made to the patriarchs. The J writer tells stories that emphasize God's intimate relationship with humanity and God's special covenant with the descendants of Abraham. The E source, or Elohist, seems to have originated in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 9th century BCE. This source uses the generic term Elohim for God until the divine name is revealed to Moses, and it shows particular interest in prophecy and divine communication through dreams and visions. The E writer often portrays God as more transcendent and less directly involved in human affairs than the J source does. The D source, or Deuteronomist, is the most easily identifiable because it consists primarily of the book of Deuteronomy and shows clear connections to the religious reforms of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE. This source emphasizes centralized worship in Jerusalem, strict monotheism, and obedience to divine law as the key to national survival. The P source, or priestly source, reflects the concerns of the post-exilic period when the Jewish community was rebuilding after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. This source shows intense interest in ritual purity, genealogies, the priesthood, and the proper organization of religious life. The P writer often presents God as transcendent and holy, approachable only through carefully prescribed rituals. When you understand these different sources and their historical contexts, the Torah becomes not just a religious text, but a window into the evolving faith and circumstances of ancient Israel across several centuries. You can see how different communities at different times understood their relationship with God, their history, and their destiny. But here's what makes this theory so controversial. If the documentary hypothesis is correct, then the traditional understanding of biblical authorship is fundamentally wrong. Moses didn't write the Torah. In fact, much of the Torah was written centuries after Moses supposedly lived. The 5 books that form the foundation of Judaism and Christianity are actually anonymous compositions that were later attributed to Moses to give them authority and antiquity. This revelation has profound implications that extend far beyond academic biblical studies. If the Torah is a human composition rather than a direct divine revelation, what does that mean for religious faith? If the biblical authors were anonymous scribes working with older traditions, rather than divinely inspired prophets, how should we understand biblical authority? And if the Bible contains multiple, sometimes contradictory perspectives on fundamental theological questions, what does that tell us about the nature of religious truth? These questions have been debated in universities and seminaries for over a century, but they've rarely penetrated into popular consciousness. Most religious believers today still assume that Moses wrote the Torah, even though virtually no biblical scholar at any major university shares that view. This disconnect between scholarly consensus and popular belief has created a fascinating tension in how we approach one of the world's most influential texts. The evidence for multiple authorship continues to accumulate. Linguistic analysis shows that different parts of the Torah reflect the Hebrew language as it was spoken in different historical periods. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed that many of the laws and customs described in the Torah match practices known from specific periods in ancient Near Eastern history. Literary analysis has identified editorial techniques and compositional strategies that reveal how ancient scribes worked with their source materials. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from what scholars call the smoking gun passages, where you can literally watch the ancient editor at work. Take the story of Abraham's covenant with God. If you read Genesis chapter 15, you'll find a dramatic nighttime ceremony where God appears to Abraham in a vision, promises him countless descendants, and seals the covenant through an ancient ritual involving sacrificed animals and a smoking firepot. The language is intimate and anthropomorphic. God is called Yahweh throughout. Abraham questions God directly, and God responds with patience and reassurance. Now skip ahead to Genesis chapter 17, and you'll find what appears to be the same covenant ceremony happening all over again. But this time, everything is different. God appears as El Shaddai, not Yahweh. The language is formal and ritualistic. Instead of a nighttime vision with smoking sacrifices, we have a daylight encounter focused on circumcision as the sign of the covenant. Abraham doesn't question God. He falls on his face in reverence. Even Abraham's age is different in the two accounts. These aren't two parts of the same story. They're two completely different traditions about when and how God made his covenant with Abraham. One comes from the J source, with its intimate portrayal of God and its focus on divine promise. The other comes from the P source, with its emphasis on ritual purity and formal religious observance. The ancient editor who combined these sources didn't try to harmonize the contradictions. He didn't edit out the inconsistencies. Instead, he preserved both accounts side by side, trusting that readers would understand they were dealing with multiple sacred traditions rather than a single historical report. This editorial approach appears throughout the Torah, and once you learn to recognize it, you start seeing the seams everywhere. The two genealogies of Seth's descendants in Genesis 4 and 5 that give completely different lifespans for the same people. The two accounts of Moses receiving the law, one where he stays on the mountain for 40 days and nights, another where he goes up and down multiple times. The two versions of the Passover instructions with different requirements for how the lamb should be prepared and eaten. Each time, you can see the careful hand of an editor who valued both traditions too much to discard either one. It's like watching someone create a family photo album where they include both the formal portraits and the candid snapshots, even when they show the same people in completely different poses. But the sources don't just differ in their stories. They differ in their fundamental theology, their understanding of God's character, and their vision of what it means to be God's chosen people. The J source presents a God who walks in gardens, smells sacrifices, changes his mind, and engages in direct conversation with human beings. This is a God of relationship, emotion, and immediate presence. When J describes creation, God forms humanity from clay like a potter and breathes life into their nostrils. When J tells the flood story, God is genuinely grieved by human wickedness and later regrets the destruction he has caused. The P source, by contrast, presents a God of transcendent majesty who speaks creation into existence through pure divine word. This God doesn't walk or smell or change his mind. When P describes creation, it happens through cosmic decree. Let there be light, and there was light. When P tells the flood story, it's a carefully orchestrated reversal of the creation process, with precise dates and measurements and ritualistic language. These aren't just different writing styles, They're different theological worldviews, different ways of understanding the nature of divine reality. The J writer sees God as intimately involved in human affairs, almost like a character in the story. The P writer sees God as the transcendent architect of cosmic order, approached only through carefully prescribed rituals and maintained boundaries. The E source falls somewhere between these extremes, presenting a God who communicates through dreams, visions, and prophetic messengers, rather than direct conversation. When E tells stories, God often remains somewhat distant, working through intermediaries and supernatural signs. This reflects a theology that emphasizes divine transcendence while still maintaining the possibility of divine communication. The D source has yet another perspective, focusing almost exclusively on the covenant relationship between God and Israel. For the D writer, the key question isn't the nature of God's character, but the terms of God's relationship with his chosen people. This source emphasizes law, obedience, centralized worship, and the consequences of faithfulness or unfaithfulness to the covenant. When you read the Torah with these different theological perspectives in mind, you realize you're not just reading one book. You're reading a theological conversation that spans centuries, where different communities and different generations wrestled with fundamental questions about God, humanity, and the meaning of existence. This conversation wasn't always harmonious. Sometimes the sources directly contradict each other. The J source suggests that people began calling on the name of Yahweh from the very beginning, starting with Adam's grandson, Enosh. The E and P sources insist that the divine name wasn't revealed until God appeared to Moses at the burning bush. The D source emphasizes that God chose one specific location for centralized worship, while the J and E sources show the patriarchs building altars and offering sacrifices wherever they encounter God. These contradictions aren't accidental. They reflect real theological debates that were happening in ancient Israel. Should worship be centralized in Jerusalem, or can people encounter God anywhere? Is God's name eternal and unchanging, or was it revealed at a specific moment in history? Does God relate to humanity through intimate personal relationship or through formal religious institutions? The genius of the final editor wasn't that he resolved these debates, it's that he preserved them. Rather than imposing a single theological perspective, he created a text that contains multiple viewpoints, multiple approaches to the divine, multiple ways of understanding what it means to be in relationship with God. This editorial philosophy has profound implications for how we read the Bible today. If the Torah preserves multiple theological perspectives rather than presenting a single, unified worldview, then perhaps faithful reading requires us to engage with that theological diversity rather than trying to harmonize it away. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more fascinating. The four sources weren't just theological documents. They were also political texts, written during some of the most turbulent periods in ancient Israel's history. The J source appears to have been written during the golden age of the United Monarchy under King Solomon, when Israel was a prosperous, unified nation with international influence. This historical context explains J's optimistic tone, its focus on divine promises, and its confidence in Israel's special relationship with God. The J writer was telling stories for a people who saw themselves as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The E source emerged in the northern kingdom of Israel after the monarchy split, when the 10 northern tribes had separated from Judah and established their own kingdom with their own religious institutions. This explains E's emphasis on prophecy and divine communication through intermediaries rather than through the Jerusalem temple. The E writer was validating the northern kingdom's claim to authentic religious authority. The D source reflects the crisis of the late 7th century BCE, when the Assyrian and Babylonian empires were threatening Israel's survival. This source's emphasis on covenant obedience, centralized worship, and the consequences of unfaithfulness speaks directly to a community facing potential destruction. The D writer was calling the people back to faithful observance as their only hope for survival. The P source comes from the period after the Babylonian exile, when the Jewish community was rebuilding their religious and social institutions from scratch. This explains P's intense focus on ritual purity, proper religious procedures, and the genealogies that established legitimate authority. The P writer was providing a blueprint for reconstructing Jewish identity in a post-catastrophic world. Each source, in other words, was addressing the specific needs and concerns of its historical moment. But when the final editor combined them into a single text, he created something unprecedented, a religious document that spoke to multiple historical situations simultaneously, that preserved the wisdom and insights of different generations, and that refused to reduce the complexity of religious experience to a single perspective. This editorial achievement becomes even more remarkable when you consider the technical skill required to weave 4 different sources into a coherent narrative. The editor couldn't just paste the sources together randomly. He had to create transitions, resolve chronological problems, and maintain narrative flow while preserving the integrity of each source. Sometimes you can see exactly how he did this. In the flood narrative, he alternates between the J and P accounts every few verses, carefully selecting which details to include from each source to create a composite story that honors both traditions. When the sources disagree about numbers or dates, he often includes both figures, creating apparent contradictions that actually preserve multiple authentic traditions. The editor's technique was so sophisticated that it took scholars nearly 2 centuries to reverse engineer his methods. Even today, there are passages where experts disagree about which source contributed which verses. The ancient editor was, in many ways, a literary genius whose work deserves recognition alongside the greatest achievements in world literature. But his achievement was also deeply theological. By preserving multiple sources with their different perspectives on God and religious life, he created a text that models theological humility. Rather than claiming to have the final word on divine truth, the Torah acknowledges that different people in different circumstances might encounter God in different ways. This theological sophistication has been largely lost in popular religious discourse, where the Bible is often treated as a single unified voice speaking with absolute authority on every subject. But the documentary hypothesis reveals a text that is far more complex and far more interesting than that simple reading suggests. The implications extend far beyond academic biblical studies. If the Torah models theological diversity rather than demanding theological uniformity, what does that suggest about how religious communities should approach controversial questions? If the biblical authors were anonymous scribes working with inherited traditions, rather than divinely inspired individuals receiving direct revelation, how should that affect our understanding of biblical authority? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're questions that deserve serious engagement. The documentary hypothesis isn't just a theory about ancient literature. It's a window into how religious traditions develop, how communities preserve and reinterpret their sacred stories, and how human beings across centuries have struggled to understand their relationship with the divine. And we're just getting started. Because once you understand how scholars identified these four sources, you can begin to see their individual fingerprints throughout the entire Torah. Each author had distinctive vocabulary, characteristic theological concerns, and recognizable literary techniques that appear wherever their work has been preserved. The J writer, for instance, had a particular fascination with wordplay and etymology. Throughout the J source, you'll find stories that explain the origins of place names through puns and linguistic connections. When Jacob wrestles with the mysterious figure at the Jabbok River, the J writer can't resist pointing out that Jacob's new name, Israel, means he who strives with God. When the Tower of Babel is built, the J writer explains that the place got its name because God confused the languages there, using the Hebrew word Balal, which sounds like Babel. This isn't just clever writing. It reveals a mind that saw deep connections between language, meaning, and divine purpose. The J writer believed that even the names of places and people carried theological significance, that you could read the purposes of God in the very sounds of Hebrew words. The J source also shows a remarkable psychological sophistication in its character development. When the J writer tells the story of Cain and Abel, he doesn't just report that Cain killed his brother. He takes you inside Cain's mind, showing you the progression from disappointment to anger, to jealousy, to murder. When the J writer describes Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, he captures the internal struggle of a father torn between divine command and paternal love. This psychological realism sets the J source apart from ancient Near Eastern literature, which typically focused on external actions rather than internal motivations. The J writer understood that religious stories needed to explore not just what people did, but why they did it, what they felt about it, and how those feelings shaped their relationship with God. The E writer had completely different literary priorities. Where J focused on psychology and wordplay, E was fascinated by dreams, visions, and the mechanics of divine communication. The E source gives us some of the most memorable supernatural encounters in the entire Bible. Jacob's dream of the ladder reaching to heaven, Moses' encounter with the burning bush, Balaam's talking donkey. But E's approach to these supernatural elements is distinctly different from J's. When the J writer describes God appearing to Abraham, it's often in the form of ordinary human visitors who share a meal and engage in normal conversation. When the E writer describes divine encounters, there's always something clearly supernatural happening, some obvious sign that this is not ordinary human experience. This difference reflects distinct theological perspectives on how God relates to the world. The J writer saw the divine as intimately woven into ordinary human experience, present in every conversation and every decision. The E writer saw a clearer distinction between the divine and human realms, with God communicating across that divide through special revelatory experiences. The E source also shows particular concern with testing and moral decision-making. It's the E writer who gives us the story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, framed explicitly as a test of faith. It's E who tells us about the golden calf incident, where the Israelites fail a crucial test of loyalty to God. E's stories often revolve around moments of moral choice, where characters must decide between competing loyalties or values. This focus on testing reflects E's historical context in the Northern Kingdom, where religious and political legitimacy were constantly being questioned and defended. The E writer was addressing a community that needed to understand how to remain faithful to God in circumstances where the traditional sources of religious authority were absent or compromised. The P writer brought yet another set of literary and theological priorities to the Torah, where J told psychologically complex stories and E focused on supernatural revelation. P was primarily interested in structure, order, and proper procedure. The P source reads less like narrative literature and more like a combination of legal code and historical chronicle. When P tells the creation story, it unfolds with mathematical precision. 6 days of creative work, each building systematically on the previous day, culminating in the Sabbath rest. When P describes the construction of the tabernacle, every measurement is specified, every material is listed, every procedure is detailed with ritualistic precision. This wasn't accidental. The P writer was addressing a community that had lost its temple, its priesthood, and its traditional religious institutions. They needed to know not just what God had done in the past, but exactly how religious life should be reconstructed in the present. P provided that blueprint with meticulous attention to detail. But P's contribution goes far beyond religious regulations. The P source also gave us some of the most theologically sophisticated passages in the entire Bible. The opening chapter of Genesis, with its majestic vision of creation through divine speech, represents one of the high points of ancient religious literature. The P writer's ability to combine cosmic vision with practical instruction created a unique literary achievement. The D source brought still another voice to this theological conversation. Where the other sources focused on narrative and law, D was primarily concerned with preaching and persuasion. The book of Deuteronomy reads like a series of sermons, with Moses addressing the Israelites directly, explaining the significance of their history and the requirements of their covenant with God. D's rhetorical style is unmistakable. This writer loved repetition, parallel phrases, and emotional appeals. When D wants to emphasize the importance of loving God, the text doesn't just say it once, it repeats the command multiple times in slightly different words, building emotional intensity through linguistic rhythm. The D writer also had a particular genius for connecting historical narrative with theological interpretation. D didn't just tell you what happened. D explained why it happened, what it meant, and what lessons contemporary readers should draw from it. This interpretive approach would later become central to Jewish and Christian approaches to reading scripture. But here's what makes the documentary hypothesis so fascinating from a literary perspective. When you separate these 4 sources and read them independently, each one tells a complete, coherent story. The J source alone gives you a full narrative arc from creation through the patriarchs to the exodus from Egypt. The P source provides its own complete account of the same events, but from a completely different theological perspective. This means that the ancient editor wasn't just combining fragments or filling in gaps. He was working with 4 complete, independent accounts of Israel's origins, each written for different audiences with different concerns. His task was to preserve all 4 perspectives while creating a single narrative that honored each tradition. The sophistication of this editorial achievement becomes clearer when you consider the alternatives. The editor could have chosen one source as authoritative and discarded the others. He could have attempted to harmonize the contradictions by rewriting the sources to eliminate disagreements. He could have clearly marked which passages came from which sources, creating an obvious anthology rather than a unified narrative. Instead, he chose the most difficult path, preserving the integrity of each source while weaving them together so seamlessly that for over 2 millennia, readers assumed they were dealing with a single author. This editorial philosophy reveals a remarkable theological sophistication, an understanding that religious truth might be too complex to be captured by any single perspective. The editor's technique also reveals something important about how ancient communities understood textual authority. In our modern context, we tend to assume that authority comes from single authorship, that a text is more reliable if it has one clear voice speaking with consistent perspective. But the Torah suggests a different model, where authority comes from the preservation of multiple authentic traditions, where the conversation between different viewpoints is more valuable than any single voice speaking alone. This ancient editorial philosophy has profound implications for how we read not just the Torah, but any complex religious or philosophical text. Instead of trying to force artificial unity onto diverse materials, we might learn to appreciate the richness that comes from multiple perspectives engaging with the same fundamental questions. But the documentary hypothesis raises another crucial question that we haven't fully addressed yet. If Moses didn't write the Torah, then who were these 4 anonymous authors, and why did they choose to remain unnamed? The anonymity of the biblical authors is actually quite remarkable when you consider the literary culture of the ancient Near East. Most significant texts from this period were attributed to known figures, kings, prophets, sages, or scribes who wanted their names associated with their work. The fact that the Torah's authors chose to remain anonymous suggests something important about how they understood their role and their message. The J writer, despite creating some of the most memorable stories in world literature, never once identifies himself or claims credit for his work. The P writer, despite providing the legal and ritual framework that would govern Jewish religious life for millennia, never mentions his own name or authority. The E and D writers, despite addressing crucial theological and political questions, remain completely anonymous. This anonymity wasn't accidental. It reflects a particular understanding of religious authority that differs sharply from our modern assumptions about authorship and originality. These writers didn't see themselves as creative innovators producing original content. They saw themselves as preservers and interpreters of ancient traditions that had been passed down through generations. The J writer wasn't inventing the story of Abraham and Sarah. He was crafting a literary version of stories that had been told around campfires and in family gatherings for centuries. The P writer wasn't creating new religious laws out of thin air. He was systematizing and preserving ritual practices that had developed over generations of religious experience. This understanding of authorship helps explain why the sources so often contradict each other on factual details, while agreeing on fundamental theological points. Each writer was working with slightly different versions of the traditional stories, different emphases that had developed in different communities or different time periods. When the J writer says that people began calling on the name of Yahweh from the time of Adam's grandson Enosh, he's preserving one tradition about the antiquity of divine worship. When the P writer insists that the divine name wasn't revealed until Moses' encounter with the burning bush, he's preserving a different tradition that emphasizes the special significance of the Exodus experience. Both traditions could be true in the sense that both preserved authentic aspects of ancient Israel's understanding of their relationship with God. The contradiction isn't a problem to be solved. It's evidence that the biblical authors valued the preservation of multiple authentic traditions over the creation of artificial consistency. This approach to traditional material also helps explain why the biblical authors felt free to adapt, expand, and reinterpret the stories they inherited. They weren't trying to preserve ancient traditions unchanged, like museum curators protecting historical artifacts. They were trying to make those traditions speak meaningfully to their contemporary audiences, like translators working to communicate ancient wisdom in modern language. The J-writer told stories about the patriarchs that addressed the political and theological concerns of the Solomonic period. The E-writer adapted those same stories to speak to the different circumstances of the northern kingdom. The P-writer retold them again for the post-exilic community that was rebuilding their religious life from scratch. Each retelling preserved the essential meaning of the traditional stories while adapting their expression to new circumstances. This dynamic approach to tradition would later become central to Jewish interpretive methods and would influence how both Jewish and Christian communities approached the ongoing interpretation of biblical texts. But the anonymity of the biblical authors also raises fascinating questions about the relationship between individual creativity and communal authority. In our modern literary culture, we celebrate individual authors and associate creative works with specific personalities. We want to know who wrote what, when they wrote it, and what personal experiences shaped their perspective. The biblical authors seem to have had a completely different relationship to their work. They were content to let their individual voices disappear into the larger communal voice of Israel's ongoing conversation with God. They were more interested in serving the community's need for meaningful religious literature than in establishing their own literary reputations. This self-effacing approach to authorship creates its own kind of authority. When you don't know who wrote a text, you can't dismiss it based on personal disagreements with the author. When the text speaks with an anonymous voice, it forces you to engage with the ideas themselves rather than with the personality behind them. The anonymity also allows the text to speak with a kind of timeless authority that transcends the specific historical circumstances of its composition. Because you don't know exactly when or where or by whom each passage was written, the text can address readers across centuries and cultures without being limited by its original historical context. This timeless quality helps explain why the Torah has remained meaningful to readers across vastly different historical circumstances. The text's ability to speak to new situations isn't accidental. It's built into the very structure of the work, through the editorial decision to preserve multiple perspectives and to allow those perspectives to remain in creative tension with each other. But the question of authorial identity becomes even more complex when you consider the role of the final editor, the figure scholars call the redactor or R. This anonymous figure, working probably in the 5th century BCE, was responsible for the final shape of the Torah as we know it today. The redactor wasn't just a compiler or copyist. He was a creative artist in his own right, making sophisticated decisions about how to combine the sources, where to place the seams, how to handle contradictions, and what kind of overall theological message the final text should convey. In some ways, the redactor might be considered the most important author of the Torah, since his editorial decisions determined how millions of readers across centuries would encounter these ancient traditions. But like the sources he was combining, the redactor chose to remain completely anonymous, leaving no trace of his individual perspective or personality. This creates a fascinating paradox. The most influential religious text in human history was shaped by at least 5 different anonymous figures, the 4 source authors plus the final editor, none of whom claimed individual credit for their contributions, none of whom left any personal information about their lives or motivations. We know more about the personal lives of ancient poets and historians who wrote works that are now read only by specialists than we know about the people who created the foundational text of 3 major world religions. Their anonymity is so complete that we can't even be certain about their gender, though the conventional assumption has been that they were all male scribes working in temple or court settings. This anonymity forces us to engage with the Torah as a communal creation rather than as the product of individual genius. Instead of asking what Moses or any other single author intended to communicate, we have to ask what the ancient Israelite community, working across several centuries, understood about God, humanity, and the meaning of existence. This shift in perspective has profound implications for how we interpret biblical texts. Instead of looking for a single consistent message, we learn to appreciate the theological conversation that unfolds across different sources and different historical periods. Instead of trying to harmonize contradictions, we learn to see them as evidence of a community wrestling with complex questions that don't have simple answers. The documentary hypothesis thus offers more than just a theory about biblical authorship. It provides a model for understanding how religious communities develop, preserve, and reinterpret their sacred traditions across time. It shows us a community that valued multiple perspectives, that preserved disagreement alongside agreement, and that trusted future readers to engage thoughtfully with the complexity they inherited. And that brings us to the most controversial aspect of this entire discussion: what the documentary hypothesis means for contemporary religious faith and biblical authority. For traditional believers, the documentary hypothesis presents what can only be described as an existential crisis. If the Torah wasn't dictated by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, if it's actually a human compilation of multiple sources written across centuries, then what happens to the doctrine of biblical inerrancy? What happens to the belief that every word of Scripture carries divine authority? This crisis isn't theoretical. It's playing out right now in seminaries, churches, and synagogues around the world, where religious leaders are grappling with how to reconcile scholarly consensus with traditional faith claims. Some have chosen to reject the scholarly evidence entirely, insisting that Moses wrote the Torah despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Others have attempted to find middle ground, arguing that Moses could have used sources while still maintaining overall authorial control. But perhaps the most fascinating response has come from those who see the documentary hypothesis not as a threat to faith, but as a deeper revelation of how God works through human communities across time. These interpreters argue that a text produced by multiple authors working across centuries might actually be more theologically sophisticated than one written by a single individual, even if that individual was Moses. Think about it this way. If the Torah preserves 4 different theological perspectives on fundamental questions about God and human existence, then perhaps divine revelation isn't a single moment of communication, but an ongoing conversation that unfolds across generations. Perhaps God speaks not through individual prophets receiving direct dictation, but through communities wrestling with sacred traditions and discovering new depths of meaning in ancient stories. This perspective suggests that the anonymous authors of the Torah weren't obstacles to divine revelation, but participants in it. When the J writer crafted psychologically complex stories about the patriarchs, he was exploring theological truths about human nature and divine grace. When the P writer systematized religious law and ritual, he was discovering divine order in communal religious experience. When the E writer focused on dreams and visions, he was mapping the landscape of divine communication. When the D writer connected historical events with theological interpretation, he was revealing the patterns of divine justice and mercy in human history. The final editor who wove these sources together wasn't corrupting pure divine revelation, but recognizing that religious truth is complex enough to require multiple perspectives. His decision to preserve contradictions, rather than harmonizing them, suggests a sophisticated understanding that divine reality might be too vast to be captured by any single human viewpoint. This interpretive approach has profound implications for how religious communities might approach contemporary theological questions. Instead of assuming that faithful interpretation requires finding a single, unanimous biblical position on complex issues, communities might learn to appreciate the theological diversity preserved within the biblical text itself. But the implications extend beyond theology into questions of historical accuracy and scientific reliability. If the Torah is a human compilation of traditional materials rather than a direct divine communication, then perhaps it shouldn't be expected to conform to modern standards of historical or scientific accuracy. Perhaps its truth lies not in its factual precision, but in its theological insight. The creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2, for instance, might not be competing scientific accounts of how the universe began, but complementary theological reflections on the meaning and purpose of existence. The flood narrative might not be a historical report of a global catastrophe, but a profound meditation on divine justice, human wickedness, and the possibility of new beginnings. This doesn't mean the biblical stories are just myths in the sense of being false or meaningless. It means they might be myths in the deeper sense of being stories that reveal truths about reality that can't be captured through purely factual reporting. The story of Adam and Eve might not tell us what happened in a specific garden at a particular moment in history, but it might tell us something profoundly true about the human condition, about our relationship with the divine, and about the nature of moral responsibility. This distinction between factual accuracy and theological truth has become increasingly important as scientific discoveries have challenged traditional religious claims about the age of the universe, the development of life, and the origins of humanity. Rather than forcing believers to choose between scientific evidence and religious faith, the documentary hypothesis suggests a third option: understanding biblical texts as theological literature that addresses questions of meaning and purpose, rather than questions of scientific or historical fact. But this interpretive approach also raises new questions about biblical authority. If the Bible doesn't speak with a single unified voice, if it preserves multiple perspectives that sometimes contradict each other, then how should religious communities determine what biblical teachings to follow and which ones to question? This question becomes particularly acute when dealing with biblical passages that seem to conflict with contemporary moral sensibilities. The Torah contains laws that permit slavery, subordinate women, and prescribe death penalties for various offenses. Traditional interpretation might explain these passages as divine commands that must be accepted regardless of contemporary moral intuitions. But if the Torah is a human document reflecting the moral understanding of ancient communities, then perhaps these passages should be understood as historical artifacts rather than timeless moral principles. The documentary hypothesis doesn't resolve these interpretive challenges, but it does provide a framework for approaching them with greater sophistication. Instead of treating the Bible as a single voice speaking with uniform authority on all subjects, readers can learn to recognize the different perspectives preserved within the text, and to engage thoughtfully with the theological conversations that unfold across different sources and different historical periods. This approach requires what we might call theological maturity, the ability to live with complexity and ambiguity rather than demanding simple answers to complex questions. It requires readers who are willing to wrestle with difficult texts rather than either accepting them uncritically or rejecting them wholesale. But perhaps most importantly, it requires communities that can model theological humility, recognizing that their understanding of divine truth is always partial and provisional, always open to new insights and deeper understanding. The stakes in this conversation extend far beyond academic biblical studies or seminary classrooms. How religious communities understand the nature and authority of their sacred texts shapes how they approach everything from personal morality to social justice to political engagement. Communities that read the Bible as a single, inerrant voice, speaking with uniform authority on all subjects, tend to develop very different approaches to contemporary moral and political questions than communities that understand the Bible as a complex conversation between multiple perspectives across different historical periods. The documentary hypothesis suggests that faithful biblical interpretation might require not less sophistication, but more, not simpler answers, but greater comfort with complexity. It challenges readers to move beyond proof texting, where individual verses are extracted from their literary and historical contexts to support predetermined positions, toward more holistic approaches that take seriously the full complexity of the biblical witness. This shift in interpretive method has already begun to influence how many religious communities approach controversial contemporary issues. Instead of assuming that the Bible speaks with a single voice on questions like gender roles, economic justice, or environmental responsibility, these communities are learning to identify the different perspectives preserved within biblical texts and to engage thoughtfully with the theological principles that might guide faithful responses to contemporary challenges. But the documentary hypothesis also raises questions that extend beyond religious communities to anyone interested in how human societies develop, preserve, and transmit their foundational stories. The process by which the Torah was composed and compiled offers a fascinating case study in how communities create authoritative texts that can speak meaningfully across vastly different historical circumstances. The ancient Israelite community faced a challenge that confronts every society: how to preserve traditional wisdom while adapting it to new circumstances, how to maintain continuity with the past while remaining relevant to the present. Their solution was remarkably sophisticated. Instead of choosing between competing traditions, they found ways to preserve multiple perspectives within a single authoritative text. This editorial philosophy created a text that was simultaneously conservative and innovative, traditional and adaptive. Conservative because it preserved ancient stories and laws that had been passed down through generations. Innovative because it found new ways to combine and interpret those traditions for contemporary audiences. The result was a text that could speak to multiple historical situations simultaneously, that could address the concerns of both settled agricultural communities and displaced refugees, both wealthy urban dwellers and struggling rural farmers, both those living under foreign domination and those enjoying political independence. This adaptability helps explain why the Torah has remained influential across such diverse historical circumstances. Unlike texts that address only the specific concerns of their original historical context, the Torah's preservation of multiple perspectives allows it to speak to new situations that its original authors never could have anticipated. The editorial techniques developed by the Torah's compilers would later influence how other religious communities approached the creation of authoritative texts. The New Testament shows similar evidence of multiple sources being combined by editors who preserved different perspectives on the same events. The Quran, despite traditional claims of single authorship, shows internal evidence of multiple layers of composition and editorial activity. Even secular literature has been influenced by these ancient editorial techniques. Modern novels that preserve multiple narrative voices or present different perspectives on the same events owe something to the sophisticated editorial methods pioneered by the Torah's anonymous compilers. But perhaps the most important legacy of the documentary hypothesis lies in what it reveals about the nature of human knowledge and the complexity of truth itself. The ancient editors who created the Torah understood something that many contemporary readers have forgotten: that reality is complex enough to require multiple perspectives, that truth is rich enough to sustain different approaches, and that wisdom often emerges not from choosing between alternatives, but from holding them in creative tension. This understanding has profound implications that extend far beyond religious interpretation. In an era when political discourse has become increasingly polarized, when complex issues are reduced to simple talking points, and when different communities seem incapable of engaging constructively with perspectives that challenge their own assumptions, the Torah's editorial philosophy offers an alternative model. Instead of demanding that everyone speak with a single voice, perhaps communities can learn to preserve and value different perspectives. Instead of treating disagreement as a problem to be solved, perhaps societies can learn to see it as a resource to be cultivated. Instead of assuming that truth is simple enough to be captured by any single viewpoint, perhaps we can develop the intellectual and spiritual maturity to engage thoughtfully with complexity. The four anonymous authors who secretly wrote the Torah left behind more than just a religious text. They left behind a model for how human communities can preserve wisdom, engage with complexity, and create authoritative voices that speak across centuries and cultures. Their anonymity ensures that we focus not on their individual personalities, but on the collaborative achievement they created together. Their willingness to let their individual perspectives be woven into a larger communal voice demonstrates a kind of intellectual humility that seems increasingly rare in our contemporary culture. And their success in creating a text that has remained meaningful to billions of readers across vastly different historical circumstances suggests that their editorial philosophy might have something important to teach us about how to create literature, build communities, and approach truth itself. The documentary hypothesis began as a scholarly theory about ancient literature, but it has become something more, a window into how human beings across centuries have struggled to understand themselves, their world, and their relationship with whatever ultimate reality they encounter in the depths of existence. The 4 anonymous authors of the Torah may have intended to remain hidden, but their fingerprints are everywhere for those who know how to look. And in learning to recognize their individual contributions, we learn something important about the collaborative nature of all human knowledge and the complex beauty of texts that preserve multiple voices speaking across time. But there's still more to this story, because the documentary hypothesis doesn't just explain how the Torah was composed. It also reveals how ancient editors worked with their source materials, what techniques they used to combine different traditions, and how they made decisions about what to preserve, what to modify, and how to create coherence from diverse materials. Understanding these editorial techniques opens up an entirely new way of reading not just the Torah, but any complex text that shows evidence of multiple sources or editorial layers. And when you start looking for these techniques, you begin to see them everywhere, not just in ancient religious literature, but in modern texts that preserve multiple perspectives or combine different types of material. The ancient editors were, in many ways, pioneers of what we now call intertextuality, the recognition that all texts are in conversation with other texts. That meaning emerges not just from individual works, but from the relationships between different voices and different perspectives. The implications of this editorial mastery become even more striking when you examine specific passages where you can literally watch the ancient editor at work, making split-second decisions about which details to preserve from competing traditions. Take the story of Joseph's sale into slavery, one of the most psychologically complex narratives in Genesis. If you read it carefully, you'll notice something odd about who exactly sold Joseph to the Egyptians. In some verses, it's his brothers who sell him to Ishmaelite traders. In other verses, it's Midianite merchants who pull him out of the pit and take him to Egypt. The names of the buyers change, the sequence of events shifts, and even Joseph's price varies depending on which tradition you're following. But here's what's fascinating. When you separate these competing accounts, each one tells a complete, emotionally coherent story. One tradition focuses on the brothers' premeditated betrayal, their calculated decision to profit from Joseph's misfortune. The other tradition emphasizes the role of chance and circumstance, with passing merchants discovering Joseph and rescuing him from what might have been certain death. The ancient editor could have chosen one version and discarded the other. Instead, he wove them together so skillfully that most readers never notice the seams. But his editorial choices reveal something profound about how he understood the nature of truth itself. He wasn't trying to establish what exactly happened on a particular day in ancient history. He was preserving 2 different ways of understanding how betrayal, providence, and survival intersect in human experience. This editorial philosophy appears throughout the Torah with remarkable consistency. When the sources disagreed about whether the Israelites left Egypt with great wealth or in desperate poverty, the editor preserved both traditions. When they offered different explanations for why God hardened Pharaoh's heart, he included multiple perspectives. When they provided contradictory genealogies or conflicting chronologies, he let the contradictions stand rather than forcing artificial harmony. This approach required tremendous intellectual courage. The editor was working in a culture that valued consistency and authority, yet he chose to create a text that openly preserves disagreement and multiple interpretations. He trusted future readers to engage thoughtfully with complexity, rather than demanding simple answers to complicated questions. But the editor's technique went beyond simply preserving contradictions. He developed sophisticated methods for creating thematic unity, even when his sources disagreed on factual details. Look at how he handled the theme of divine testing throughout the patriarchal narratives. The J source understood testing primarily in terms of faith and obedience, with God asking characters to trust divine promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict them. Abraham's willingness to leave his homeland, Isaac's passive acceptance of his father's near sacrifice, Jacob's patient endurance of Laban's deceptions. All of these reflected the J writer's understanding that faith requires trusting God's plan, even when that plan isn't immediately visible. The E source approached testing differently, focusing more on moral decision-making and the development of character. When E tells the story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, the emphasis falls not on blind obedience, but on the internal struggle of a parent torn between competing loyalties. When E describes Jacob's wrestling match with the mysterious figure at Peniel, the focus is on transformation through conflict rather than submission to divine will. The P source understood testing in yet another way, seeing it primarily as a means of establishing proper relationship between the human and divine realms. P's stories often revolve around questions of ritual purity, appropriate worship, and the maintenance of boundaries that preserve the holiness necessary for divine presence. The D source brought still another perspective, understanding testing primarily in terms of covenant loyalty and the consequences of faithfulness or unfaithfulness to divine law. D's version of the wilderness wanderings emphasizes the Israelites' repeated failures to trust God's provision and their need to learn obedience through hardship. The ancient editor could have forced these different understandings of divine testing into a single, coherent theology. Instead, he preserved all four perspectives, allowing them to interact and illuminated by the divine. The result is a text that acknowledges the complexity of religious experience rather than reducing it to simple formulas. This editorial sophistication becomes even more apparent when you examine how the editor handled chronological problems. The four sources didn't always agree about when events happened, how long they lasted, or in what sequence they occurred. Sometimes the disagreements were minor, a few years' difference in someone's age at death. Sometimes they were major, completely different sequences for the same series of events. Rather than forcing the sources into chronological conformity, the editor developed techniques for preserving multiple time schemes simultaneously. He would sometimes place contradictory chronologies side by side, trusting readers to understand that they were dealing with different traditional accounts rather than precise historical records. Other times, he would embed one chronology within another, creating layered time structures that honored both traditions. This approach to time reflects a sophisticated understanding that different communities might measure and remember the same events differently. The important thing wasn't establishing exact dates, but preserving the meaning that each community had found in their traditional stories. The editor's treatment of geographical details shows similar sophistication. The sources sometimes disagreed about where events took place, what routes people traveled, or how long journeys took. Rather than harmonizing these differences, the editor often preserved multiple geographical traditions, creating texts that can be read as describing either single events in specific locations or recurring patterns that happened in multiple places. This geographical flexibility allowed the Torah to speak meaningfully to communities living in different locations and facing different geographical challenges. Nomadic tribes could find their experience reflected in stories of wilderness wandering, while settled agricultural communities could identify with narratives of land inheritance and boundary establishment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the editor's technique was his ability to create emotional coherence, even when combining sources with very different literary styles and theological perspectives. The J source's intimate, anthropomorphic narratives had to be woven together with P's formal, ritualistic language. E's focus on dreams and supernatural communication had to be integrated with D's emphasis on law and covenant obligation. The editor accomplished this integration through careful attention to emotional rhythm and narrative pacing. He would often use passages from one source to create emotional preparation for revelations that came from another source. He would employ transitions that maintained narrative momentum, even when switching between sources with completely different concerns. The result is a text that reads as emotionally unified, even though it preserves multiple theological perspectives. Readers can follow character development and thematic progression across hundreds of pages without realizing they're actually reading a complex compilation of originally independent documents. This editorial achievement becomes even more impressive when you consider the physical constraints the ancient editor faced. He was working with manuscripts written on papyrus or parchment, materials that couldn't be easily edited or revised. He couldn't simply cut and paste like a modern word processor user. Every editorial decision had to be carefully planned and executed with minimal opportunity for revision. Yet despite these constraints, he created a text whose editorial seams are so skillfully hidden that it took scholars centuries to reverse engineer his methods. His work represents one of the greatest achievements in the history of literary editing, comparable to the finest examples of modern editorial craftsmanship. The editor's success also reveals something important about the nature of textual authority in ancient communities. Modern readers often assume that authority comes from single authorship, from having one clear voice speaking with consistent perspective. But the Torah suggests that ancient communities had a different understanding of how texts acquire and maintain authority. For these communities, authority came not from individual genius, but from communal recognition that a text successfully preserved and interpreted the traditions that defined their identity. A text became authoritative not because it was written by a famous author, but because it captured the ongoing conversation between past and present, between inherited tradition and contemporary understanding. This communal approach to textual authority explains why the biblical authors were content to remain anonymous, and why the editor was willing to preserve contradictions rather than imposing artificial unity. They weren't trying to create monuments to individual creativity. They were trying to serve their community's need for meaningful engagement with their foundational traditions. And so, we arrive at the end of our investigation into one of the most profound discoveries in the history of biblical scholarship. 4 anonymous authors, working across centuries, their individual voices now forever woven into the fabric of a text that has shaped civilizations. The fingerprints are there for anyone willing to look. The evidence is overwhelming for anyone willing to examine it. Yet most believers remain unaware that the foundation of their faith rests not on the words of Moses, but on the collaborative genius of unknown scribes who chose to let their names disappear into history. Perhaps that's the most profound lesson of all. These authors understood something we've forgotten, that truth is complex enough to require multiple voices, that wisdom emerges not from uniformity, but from the tension between different perspectives, and that the most enduring stories are those that honor the full complexity of human experience, rather than reducing it to simple answers. The 4 anonymous authors who secretly wrote the Torah left us more than just a religious text. They left us a model for how to engage with mystery, how to preserve disagreement alongside agreement, and how to create meaning from the fragments of tradition we inherit. Their secret is hidden in plain sight, waiting for anyone curious enough to look beneath the surface and discover the remarkable conversation that has been unfolding for millennia between the lines.